Okay, so this is a brief review, partial review of the Dream 6 to 15 from the book Dreams again. Surprise, surprise. And I found some interesting material when I was looking at Dream 10, and so this is going to be recorded as a separate little review. So when I was talking about Dream 6, near the beginning of that 3 hour long diatribe, I in Dream 6 and later on in Dream 14, um, was analyzing a mistake by Jung, an interpretation that he offered, where he described how the image of the stairway in Dream 6 and the anima sitting on that stairway is a symbol of ascent. And I was arguing that, in fact, that stair is a symbol of both ascent and descent. And importantly, that is actually corroborated in Dream 6, where Jung says on page 128 at the bottom, in this case, the allusion is to a stair, thus indicating an ascent or a descent. And that, yeah, substantiates the argument that I later used to push back against Jung in, I'm not sure it was Dream 14, it was Dream 13, excuse me. So that's one thing. Another thing, yeah, around about the 5 minute mark, I was sort of talking both about the shadow and the soul as having, as connected with personhood. And personhood has ended up being an important concept for me lately in the discussion of the affinity of Atman and Brahman and how and the weaknesses of propositional and perspectival knowing in uncovering or revealing personhood, clarifying personhood, and how our stories and our relating must in some way allow us access, potentially via practices like circling, via empathic skills, relating skills, to differentiate the nature of our personhood, um, which ends up being an important dimension of sort of, I want to say, defense against nihilism, although that's not the right way of framing it. But I'm just going to leave that there and say there's something important about this quality of personhood and developing it, and that the shadow is importantly connected with that, where shadow in this context has to do with the sense of I am, the sense of so the personal shadow being sort of like everything that was repressed, that was not allowed, that we sort of deny about ourselves, and can include beneficial and non-beneficial qualities. And in individual development, there's a little picture of how that shows up where we sort of learn at a very early age, I am something. I am lovable. I am unlovable. I am noisy. I am, I don't know, I am worthy of attention. I'm not worthy of attention. I am, and any of these sort of core wounds, I would argue, end up being the sort of basis, the foundation, the core of the shadow. Um, and they form the root of ego identity, ego strength, and in a sense, self-determination that so there's a deep relationship between our personhood and those wounds and those qualities, those yeah aspects of the shadow, those depths of the shadow. But importantly, personhood is not exhausted by such wounds and such qualities. And that allows me to say that the obviously the soul as well has qualities that are deeply connected with our personhood. When we think of someone having soul, in a way, this is what we mean is that someone has a unique expression of life, uniquely vital. There's something um, differentiated and distinct about their expression that we describe as soulful. And this allows me to say that both soul and shadow are important in, yeah, relating, let's say, relating with the shadow and relating with the soul or anima, or you could say Socratic daemon, are important in both clarifying the nature of our personhood and then uncovering the correspondence between that personhood as Atman, let's say, and the transcendent or divine as Brahman. And Yeah, furthermore, you could say that the shadow and the soul therefore both have extroverted and introverted dimensions. Um, both dimensions of oneself, they arise in relationship with others, right? But they also derive from our uniqueness or our distinctiveness. So there's something about one's individual self that is involved in shadow and soul, but they're also necessarily like relational qualities. They show up relationally, almost by definition. Yeah, and that this there are important differences between them, obviously, but both are sort of invoked and required for personhood and for divinity. You could think of them as like a stages to pass through is one of the ways that Jung thinks about it. Sort of like the shadow gets in the way until it's been confronted, but it then still acts as a sort of, yeah, bastion of privacy and bastion of ego strength as a way to, yeah, keep grounded in oneself when one accesses the numinosity of the divine. That felt important to clarify. Yeah, and so that allows me to just describe what is important about Dream 5 and the connection to Dream 8. So in Dream 5, there was this like snake describing a ring around the dreamer. And in Dream 8 was this like, don't go over the rainbow, instead go under the rainbow as a symbol of humility. And in Dream 5, it's sort of the symbol of like by confrontation with an integration of the shadow that I've said the optimal conditions for the divinity of the soul are created to be drawn down. So it's by clarifying the relationship with the shadow, getting one shadow on one side, that in symbolic terms, the snake can draw a protective circle, a taboo space around one, within which one can um, create the optimal conditions for the divine mediator, the soul as mediator of divinity, to function properly and to draw down one's personal access to transcendence, to what we could call God, from within that protected space. And so we can see how in that relationship, both the shadow as a protective function and the soul as a mediating function end up being important for, yeah, individual access to transcendence. And what else there to say that yeah, in Dream 6, the veiled woman, as a figure of the anima, points the way onward as a guide. So that means the soul is, I mean, the reason for listening to the soul or following the soul or creating a relationship with the soul or the Socratic daemon is that that yeah, she's a guide. So she's connected with the anagogic ascent going up and down ladders as we progress forwards developmentally speaking. But if we recognize the utility of following her in that way, um, we have to establish the temenos, the protected space described in Dream 5 via shadow integration. And to do that requires the necessary humility. It requires being humbled in the face of one's shadow to be brought back to earth sufficiently, to allow one to follow the anima in the right way. And that is exactly the meaning expressed by Dream 8, meaning one has to go under the rainbow, not over it. It requires a quality of being low down to the ground. Um, yeah, that also clarifies what is the significance of the similarity between the circular symbols in Dream 5 and Dream 8, where in Dream 5 it's the snake describing a circle around this person near the tree, and in Dream 8 again, like the half rainbow where going under it is like essentially being in the middle of a circle. Yeah, so the connection between the shadow and the soul help to articulate that. I then wanted to talk briefly about Dream 10, which is where the unknown woman stands in the land of sheep and points the way. Yeah, this is a really interesting part for mine. So I focus on the connection here. This is about like the state of childlikeness. And in talking about that, I focused on Jung himself. So there's a quality of separation or alienation. Jung talks about the way begins in the children's land, at a time when rational present day consciousness is not yet separated from the historical psyche, the collective unconscious. The separation is indeed inevitable, but it leads to such an alienation from that dim psyche of the dawn of mankind that a loss of instinct ensues. And I talked about that as focused on Jung's own separation from his soul. So by sort of failing to stand behind as a prophet, let's say, his revelations in the Red Book, he actually enacts this separation and concomitant alienation and loss of instinct, at least to a degree. I mean, that's a bit hard on Jung, maybe. But the point is that there's obviously symbolic significance to this dream far beyond that which applies to Jung himself. So there's a universal applicability of the symbolism, and I'm saying both within individual development and collective development. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And so it's like this question, like after we've decided to follow the soul, follow the anima on her as a guide through the anagogic ascent up and down these ladders as we progress forwards on our developmental path, let's say, we've clarified that we have to be humble and low to the ground and go under the rainbow rather than over it. Then what happens? Well, what happens is that next, the veiled woman is standing in the land of sheep and pointing the way. So she immediately points the way to this state of childlikeness and the symbolism connected with it. And so there's a way that this condition ends up being an important leaving off point if one is to progress as per the guidance of the anima. And that's the reason that talking about the symbolism of this land of the sheep, this childlike state, that's the reason that it's important. So then I want to clarify that individually and collectively. So again, to say that this is applying to the dreamer, right? And the dreamer can refer to sort of anyone who's here, be that Jung, myself, anyone watching, but also it's sort of consciousness itself, and the symbolism attached to consciousness itself. So that's what allows me to unpack the symbolic relevance of this dream to both individual and collective levels, because all of that is present here now. And so, as an example, I'm going to talk about individual development and collective development, and I'm going to talk about post and pre-biographical development. So, individually, so for an individual person, let's imagine at a biographical level, the childlike state, like imagine just literally being a child. And as I was talking about earlier in connection with the shadow, that then leads to the repression of shadow material and the sort of coalescence of the ego, which is that's the separateness of the ego that this dream is pointing to. So here that separation is presented as a good thing, a necessary part of individual development. And because as I said, it ends up being the foundation of ego identity and self-definition and ego strength. This core wounds like I am unlovable, I am lovable, etc. This is the root of the I am qualities associated with the ego. And so this is a realization of the fall. So what we're talking about here is this land of the sheep is sort of this Edenic paradisal original state. This begins in the children's land. We're talking about the relevance of that to individual development, where the original childlike state is this kind of paradisal Edenic immersion in the love of the parents, let's say, and it's the development of the ego by repression of certain qualities relegated to the shadow that then actualize the fall out of that childlike state into one's biography, in particular, into ego identity, into I am an individual creature, I'm an individual person. And so that is, yeah, it's connected with the symbolism of the fall. We fall into um, our lives. We fall into our identities. We fall into our ego from out of the Eden of being in a pre-egoic state. This is a Yeah, this is a biographical and individual version of the fall, which is expressed in the symbolism of originally being in his children's land and then progressing out of that by falling into the profane history of our lives. Secondly, I'm going to talk about individual development, but I want to go a level deeper. So by drawing from people like Chris Bache, LSD and the Mind of the Universe, and his other work, Dark Knight, Early Dawn, Life Cycles, and The Living Classroom, are all extremely interesting books. And but then also drawing from people like Stan Grof and psychedelic psychotherapy as an emerging field of interest, we can know that at a more archetypal level of individual development, there's a way that this fall into our identities is actualized, is realized even before our biographical history. So I just talked about like after we're born in this first few years, everything's G, and then we have this ego that develops after that point. But even before that point, there's a metaphysics, let's say, that comes from Grothendieck, where we are before we are conceived. So that requires getting into stuff about reincarnation, and I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to offer it as an interesting thought, let's say. Before we're conceived, according to this school of thought, we're then born into our souls, born into our lives, born into our identities. In a similar way as the existential thrownness, we're thrown into this condition. We're thrown into time and space. We're thrown into being a human. Um, and this is a kind of existential dimension of the fall into history. So this is again before we're born, we're thrown into the conditions of being a human, and having everything that's unique about our time and place and space. And so, in what way is this a fall? Well, it's a kind of this idea that before that there was a kind of unity of Atman Brahman. What I want to invoke here is the um, Satchit Ananda, which I think is just straight from Buddhism, basically unity, consciousness, bliss, or peace. So this quality or this state, you could say this condition, is this unity of Atman and Brahman, the condition that goes along with that. We fall from that, we fall away from that into the human condition in some way. And that's pre-biographical. That's before we are born. So that's it's a death or a split that coincides with our conception, let's say, into our limited finite lives, away from infinity, away from transcendence, this sort of condition. Um, yeah, so I was just talking about this is again individual development, as and the qualities of individual development that are expressed by the mythology of the fall from away from this childlike state, where in this example, the childlike state would be this, yeah, correspondence of Atman and Brahman and unity consciousness bliss. And then we fall away from that condition. We fall away from that state um, into the human condition, which is developmentally speaking long before the origination of the shadow. So I just talked about two different expressions of individual development, the biographical and pre-biographical, or it could say post-birth and pre-birth expressions of the fall into profane history. Now I want to talk about the same at the collective level. So this is going to require some imagining. So if you can imagine that the if you can imagine the totality of life and of humanity, so not just the collective of humanity, but all of life together. If you can imagine that as one creature, one, you could say superorganism or collective intelligence. It doesn't necessarily need to have, like, I'm just going to sort of ask you to imagine that and, I don't know, take that as something interesting to think about at least. I'm not necessarily making any metaphysical claims about that, but if we imagine that, yeah, that creature that also has this quality or this yeah, this quality of fallenness. And I would say this collective the collective intelligence, let's say, of all of life and all of humanity, has this quality of fallenness or being trapped in its existential condition, namely our existential condition. So this is where it's not just my existential condition as me, Sam, with my particular family and background and body and identity and like that. It's our collective condition, the condition of life in this world. And the religious traditions from around the world, including but not limited to Buddhism, the Kabbalah, Christianity, Hinduism, and Gnosticism, all talk about this sort of fallen state where we have sort of in some way become trapped within this time and place and space, this matter, this unconsciousness. And a huge part of the prescriptions and the goals, the purposes of all the world's major religions are to get out of this condition again, sort of recover the um, Edenic or paradisal state which had been lost. And so, what I want to say there is that at that level of collective uh, awareness, collective consciousness, we could say, um, I would say that we've already experienced the pre-biographical fall into existence. So we've already been thrown as a collective into the conditions of time and space and the human condition, but the condition of life. But the thing is that we're as a collective, let's say collective consciousness, we're still attempting to give birth to ourselves, meaning we're still in a childlike state. So, as individuals, we've been through this pre-biographical, existential, or archetypal version of the fall, and the post-birth, so the biographical version of this fall. But at a collective level, I would say we've been through this pre-birth realization of the fall into profane history, but we haven't yet given birth to our collective selves. And that might be a reasonable take on what's going on at the moment in the world. Humanity is attempting to give birth to itself. And what's the importance of this? Yeah, so I would say that if that's the case, then at the collective level, we're still in the childlike state. We're still in the there's a state of comparative unconsciousness or pre-consciousness that goes along with that. I don't want it to seem lesser because I connected it earlier with this state of correspondence of Atman and Brahman and Satchit Ananda, bliss consciousness, peace, and unity. I know I'm messing that up, but that's okay. So this is why I'm saying that this pre-birth condition of the collective consciousness is not necessarily unconscious, but it's pre-conscious. It's not yet differentiated itself. It's not yet gone through this birth process. That doesn't make it lesser. And so we're still, as a collective, waiting to become conscious as a separate entity. So the collective consciousness is still waiting to be born into itself, let's say. And so the key difference here is that the individual has already split from the pre-egoic state, but the collective self is not yet split. Now I want to talk about what is the relevance of this difference and what are the similarities and differences in terms of how to guide moving forwards at both of those levels. So the idea would be that um, the advice given by the collective unconscious applies at all of those levels at once, but it applies in different ways. So the general idea is to listen to this unknown woman, listen to this veiled woman, or this woman who has the symbolic significance of the sun and the divinity and enlightenment associated with the sun. So the idea is, what is she saying? So what is she guiding us to? I would say that at the collective level, we talked about at the individual level, she's the image of the soul, the anima as the image of the soul. At a collective level, I would like to say that this veiled woman is the image of the soul of nature, um, or of the world soul. And I'm going to make some distinctions that I'm going to then come back to much further down the track. So I think there is a difference between the soul of nature and the soul of humanity. And I think that by, and I think those two souls, the soul of nature and the soul of humanity, can be in a kind of mutualistic, bootstrapping, symbiotic relationship that can give birth to the world soul. So I think of the world soul, Anima Mundi, excuse me, as a combination of the. So I would say that the soul of humanity and the soul of nature are both components of the world soul, and that proper relationship between them is required for the realization of the world soul. I think the veiled woman in the dreams could stand for all three of those. But in this context, the idea would be, yeah, the idea would be that by following the guidance of the feminine as it shows up in these dreams, that process could take place, and that the realization of the soul of the world, by virtue of right relationship between the soul of nature and the soul of mankind, could give birth to collective consciousness in some way that we haven't yet, that we don't know about yet because we haven't experienced it, let's say. And yeah, and so the connection there is that the the significance of the veiled woman, who different the anima at an individual and at a collective scale, um, the advice given by the anima is similar. So it's a little tricky at this part. Yeah, so the really what the anima is going to be leading to is the what Jung calls the birth of the self. So it's developmental process, and that is going to involve giving more space for the logos. So this, what is the anima saying? Well, eventually, what she's going to be saying is give expression to the emergence of the self using the logos, and um, it's particularly the symbol forming function of the logos. So I'm saying that the process of development that is indicated by the anima that has relevance at individual and collective levels leads to an understanding of the importance of empowering the logos to express the emergence of the self using the symbol forming function. Yep. But that doing so shows up differently at individual and collective levels. So there's a similarity in the sense of following the advice of the feminine principle here at individual and collective levels, which leads to a progression, leads to development along both individual and collective development. But the form of that development is different at individual and collective levels. And clarifying in what way it's different can be very helpful. Trying to work out how to talk about this further. Yeah, so let's just think in thing is that the anima has different functions and she can recommend different things. She she's sort of when we say a mediator or a guide, she can sort of give space for a new expression of vitality. But as we've talked about, it's not just about the expression of the logos, it's also about experience itself. So we could imagine, let's just imagine for the sake of argument that, that shamanism, the practice of shamanism, traditionally speaking, was an example of a social form where listening to one's anima or one's Socratic daemon, the divine double, this sort of thing, uh, was was okay. They had that going for them. Well, that could show up in different ways. For example, if someone is taking psychedelics, often as an example of, hang on, the connection there is to mystical experience. So the anima as a guide can point to and lead to the reality of mystical experience, like as a felt experience. But it can also lead to the expression of the logos. And I would say those can go together or not. And maybe they should, in the sense of the practice of shamanism, for example, in Mexico by the Mazatecs, expressed in that essay by Henry Munn. It's an amazing essay. Like, really it shows how the mushrooms of language, like they're combined, these mystical states and the expression of the logos tend to go together. And why is that critically important? It's critically important because the combination of both of those things, the accessing of mystical experience and the expression of the logos simultaneously, it realizes the development of individual and collective at the same time. And so this is this again, we're looking for this a transcendent function which is between, has the quality of mediating differences, and that means that any duality that we can find, we're looking for something that can mediate between them, at least in a sense. And so, I mean, I don't know if I could unify any difference, but I'm not going to explore that right now. Just to say that, yeah, individual and collective is an important one. So at an individual level, I want to invoke this another image of a stack that has four layers. And in this stack that has four layers, like one example of what the four could correspond to is propositional, knowing that, procedural, knowing how, perspectival, or knowing as, knowing from a perspective, and participatory, which is even deeper and more structural. The and it's at the participatory level of a in it, and so this structure shows up within individuals. This four layered stack, and at the deepest level, at the participatory level, is the level from out of which we access experiences of transcendence, mystical experiences. And when that happens, it tends to coincide with qualities of remembering the really real, remembering something that we've always known but have forgotten. So amnesis, remembering what we've forgotten, kind of quality. Um, and so there's a sense of reconnection to the divine source, so reconnection to the origins. And so what I want to imagine is that existentially speaking, in terms of individual development, when we fall into our lives, when we develop our individual egos, we retain this kind of umbilical cord, this tether, and we retain that tether, not just physically speaking, but spiritually speaking and existentially speaking, meaning we retain this access route to the divine, to the transcendent, to the ultimate. And mystical experiences, mystical states allow us to reconnect with that divine source, with that source of divinity, which involves opening up to the to transformative experience at the level of participatory knowing, which is the deepest level of our experience. Talk about the sense of that an mystical experience, individually speaking, can be measured using the mystical experience questionnaire, and we start to uncover what are the qualities. And yeah, there's often a sense of timelessness. So it's a return to the eternal, meaning the not bound by time and space, um, not bound by our limitations, which is why it's referred to with the term transcendence. There's also often a sense of going back, again, going back to the origins in the sense of the umbilical cord. So it's a return from out of our biography, from out of our life, return to the state of um, unity, consciousness, bliss that is represented by the correspondence of Atman and Brahman in Buddhism and Hinduism. I don't know enough about them, I'm sorry. So there's the qualities of the individual mystical experience. Importantly, within these experiences of transcendence and mystical experiences, the the relationship with the soul, what we call the soul, ends up being critical, where it's often that within those states, our identity takes on, like, in a sense that imagine that as a realm, just for the sake of argument. In that realm, we show up as the soul. So we sort of take on the identity of the soul in that place, if you will. And this is why the story of the meta narrative that constructs I want to say meta identity, but a combination of our identity with our ego and soul ends up being quite important in facilitating access to individual experiences of transcendence. Um, so where what I'm imagining here in terms of individual mystical experience is that if the individual is a layered phenomena with these four uh, layers of a stack, imagine that when, as an individual, we are born into our fallen state, the bottom layer, the participatory layer, stays connected to some degree through the soul with transcendence, with the ultimate, with the divine. And it's the top three layers, namely perspectival, procedural, and participatory, as an example, that fall. And it is by recovering our relationship with participation, with transformative experience, that we remember, yes, and uncover our already existing connection that we still have with the divine. And so just to invoke a further distinction, in these states of like individual mystical experience, transcendent states, there's a key difference between the experience of transcendence and the experience of collective consciousness, where we don't really have this distinction very much because these experiences are still so comparatively rare. But like in the work of someone like Chris Bache, for example, the distinction comes out very well, where we can have an experience of transcendence, but retain the quality of being an individual. For example, when we show up in that space as the soul, as we take on uh, the identity of the soul in that space, if you like. This is still an experience of being an individual, but there are also states that at the moment we call transcendent because we haven't clarified the space far enough, where we take on the identity of a collectivity. And I just feel that that's an important distinction to make. So they're not the same kinds of experiences. Um, so there can be access to transcendent states where we retain the quality of individuality, our own individuality, which we're still connected with our personhood, I would say. Um, but we can also leave the personal behind in states of transcendence and access collective states. So importantly then to say, if we imagine that at the individual level, it's the first three of the four layers that are, let's say, unconscious in our fallenness, and it's by returning to the participatory layer, the bottom layer, that we access the a return to conscious unity. But imagine that from the point of view of collective development, which requires us, like if it's true that the collective is in a state of needing to be born rather than at the individual level, we're returning from being born and reconnecting. Whereas at the collective level, we're sort of trying to be born, which is a progression rather than a going back to what we have lost. It's a moving forward to discover what we could gain. And that would imply that, let me see what it would imply. What it implies is, first of all, that um, we often experience both in states of transcendence. So, like, we experience this individual return to what we've lost, but we also experience this uh, state of the collectivity being pre-born. We can experience that in mystical experience. And both can be cathartic in a sense, like both can feel or not cathartic. They can both be terrifying and horrifying in different ways. Important to note. But importantly, there's a sense that like one of the questions is like, okay, how to orient in this, like what to do. And I'm arguing that like the function of the logos is as a mediating function actually facilitates both processes at the same time, or it can do. And so I'm saying that where we can allow the focus is on sort of the fourth layer of the stack, where the bottom layer, the deepest layer, the layer that is sort of more toward our core, toward our essence, towards our soul, um, these kinds of qualities. And it's like by allowing a both a reconnection with that layer and an expression from that layer. We can, as individuals, be reconnected with source consciousness, let's say, and as a collective, facilitate the birth of, let's say, the world soul. And I guess the overarching normative guide would be something like to allow more consciousness to be present in the world. And as an individual, that can look like to, um, reconnect with states of higher consciousness, we could say, or with states of transcendence, remember in the sense of amnesis, what we have lost. But at the same time, at a collective level, it also could be a discovery of what we have not yet found, uh, facilitating the birth process. Um, and yes, I'm furthermore saying that the function of the logos in as an expression from uh, the level of the soul, the level of participatory knowing, is to facilitate both processes at the same time, to give expression, to give voice, to give life to the collective consciousness, but also to reconvene, regather the individual within, let's say, source consciousness. And I found all of those distinctions and just clarifying that picture extremely helpful. I'm more or less then gonna stop and see if I've forgotten to say anything. Just to draw out a couple of other key difference sort of threads. Um, it's where at the individual level, it's sort of this return out of time and space, like out of timelessness. Um, out of time and space into timelessness, into the eternal, transcending away from our limitation and getting back to what we have lost in a sense, this states of individual transcendence. Whereas for the collective, it's sort of helping collective consciousness to enter into time and space and to be present here. And just to say that like this is both of those developments progress in a certain way or can be treated as such. And that's why there can be a sense of like relief or catharsis that can attend upon both. And I mean, this is why, I mean, the whole function of symbols and the symbol creating function is to facilitate life, facilitate the expression of life, mediating these different splits and allowing things to be more dynamic and moving. Yeah, again, the key difference is that the individual is already split from, whereas the collective is not yet split. I guess you could say if the experience of being sh split is so horrible for the individual, why do we want that for the collective? And I don't think it's up to us. It's not up to us to decide. And I think that gets us back to it's a sort of sense of attuning to what feels right and what feels like it wants or needs to happen. And this is what feels like it wants or needs to happen, at least from my perspective. And um, yeah, I'm again saying I'm saying that the one process, which is soul mediated symbol revelation via the logos, can develop both conditions, the individual condition and the collective condition. And I think that's why returning to the phenomenology is important. And by that I mean there is a this childlike state, which is the symbolism that we sort of originated this whole discussion with. The childlike state is an analogy to sort of beginner's mind, which looks like being present here, being directly available in up the present moment. And it's from this place. It's from this place right here, like the place that I'm speaking into and speaking from. It's from out of here that we actually fall away. Either we fall up into abstraction, we fall down into sensation, we fall somewhere. Um, and there's a sense that following the guidance of the soul in real time can lead to literally the refinement in the use of the logos as things progress. Which is why, and I think of symbols, for example, the symbol of the self with the circle and the dot. They're sort of the guiding forms of this. Um, might just sort of leave all of that for the moment. I could just then briefly elaborate on the consequences of the lack of this, named by Jung, namely the loss of instinct, loss of the instinctual atrophy and disorientation, um, and so this alienation from the fountainhead, and so like the individual sort of needs to go get back to the fountainhead and take a drink, whereas the collective needs to sort of burst through the fountainhead in a certain way. And this loss of instinct, where it's a loss of vitality on both sides, where the individual is cut off, is dissociated, disconnected from the source, from the root of life, whereas the collective is not yet alive, has not yet been born. Very like Frankensteinian, or yeah, it reminds me of the zombie, which is kind of that was what I was talking about with the zombies. That was in part four. Oh, and just to say that yeah, obviously there's the relationship between the individual and collective, which is super important. Like we have clearly both values. I mean, the divinity of the individual is kind of like the core of the inheritance from Western consciousness, which we that's what I was getting at with again part four of the conversation about zombies in Western culture, drawing from Eckhart and the discussions about personhood. Um, giving birth to the to collective consciousness in some way cannot just submerge and inundate the individual because that would be a regression, not a progression. There's something important about the individual as the center of divine worth, which is the whole importance of the temenos, the protected space of individuality, the role of the shadow and the soul is connected with one's personhood. And so part of the confusion here is that the water of life can be revivifying, but also threatening. It can also be the flood. And I guess the idea would be that like if you dam up the flood, it ends up being really big. Whereas like if you let it through with the appropriate amount of uh, force, then it's manageable, which is exactly right, right? It's where yeah, if we can guide individuals to, and I think what the risk here would be, and this is sort of a pre pre-shadowing, foreshadowing my discussion of crispation, which is forthcoming, but there's a way that um, if the individual is not properly able to integrate their shadow, then they default to experiences of the collective, which are premature, and that can be psychically and spiritually very dangerous. And so, what I'm saying here is that facilitating um, shadow integration is a critically important part of helping both the realization of personhood and also protecting against the extremely dangerous uh, risks that come with the progressive and developmental birth of the collective. It's very important to facilitate individual access to that whole process, but also to protect and honor the individual and deepen and reify them as them. And just to say that indeed this is the whole point, this is what the anima is exactly talking about, in the sense that it is by returning to the state of childlikeness as an individual that not only collective development can transpire, but the individual can retain access to genuine autonomy, genuine freedom from the overbearing influence uh, of trauma, of the influence of mother and father, and so on. Um, there's a little paradox in there where the shadow is simultaneously like a bastion of personhood and also the deepest traumas that we have, which seems to go against autonomy. I'm not going to address that at this point. I will simply say that returning to the state of childlikeness as an individual allows us to then move forward by reintegrating uh, repressed material that led to our separateness, egoically speaking. That doesn't, it doesn't, it's not about just getting rid of the ego, it's about getting the shadow on our side. And at the same time, returning to the state of childlikeness is a symbol of facilitating the development of the collective. And I will have much more to say further down the track in this series about dreams, about the relationship between individual and collective development, which I've merely alluded to in this discussion. Yeah, as Jung says, if we return to the state of, if we return to the children's land, we succumb to the fear of becoming childish because we do not understand that everything of psychic origin has a double face. One face looks forward, the other back. It's ambivalent and therefore symbolic, like all living reality. And so there's a clear sense of threat and danger that come through all of this at the same time as inspiration, hope, opportunity, and yeah, care, judiciousness, humility, all required. That will do. Finally, just to add that this has been notes in this is a revision. This is a revision of Dreams 6 through 15. And I got up to probably the first half an hour of what I recorded previously. So there's going to be still more review to come. Just to clarify what I was doing here, I was reviewing what I already said in the last video that relates to Dreams 6 through 14. And this whole commentary was connected with the first half an hour or so of that discussion.